The rain comes in sheets tonight, drumming against the wooden deck planks with a rhythm that sounds almost deliberate, almost alive. Each droplet strikes the Queen Mary's teak surface with a hollow echo that reverberates through her steel bones, a sound that has repeated itself countless times across the decades she has been moored here in Long Beach Harbor. In the distance, foghorns call out their mournful warnings, their deep bellows cutting through the Pacific mist that wraps around this 1,000-foot leviathan like a burial shroud. She sits motionless in the black water, this grand dame of the seas, her massive hull illuminated by amber dock lights that create more shadows than they dispel. During the day, tourists wander her Art Deco corridors, admiring the polished wood and gleaming brass, sleeping in her staterooms that have been converted into hotel accommodations, dining where celebrities and royalty once took their meals. But when darkness falls and the rain begins, when those foghorns echo across the harbor and most of the living have retreated to their beds, something else awakens aboard this ship. Something that refuses to acknowledge that her sailing days ended in 1967. The Queen Mary is not merely a retired ocean liner. She is a vessel that carried soldiers to war, that witnessed death in waters both calm and violent, that served as a floating prison and hospital, that collided with another ship and dragged hundreds of men to their deaths in the cold Atlantic. These experiences have left marks that no amount of renovation can erase. Deep in her lower decks, in the engine room they call number 13, past the drained swimming pools where laughter turned to screams, within the isolation ward where the sick and dying spent their final hours, the past refuses to rest. Tonight, as the rain continues its relentless assault and the fog thickens around her stationary form, one question hangs in the salt-tinged air. What happens when a ship that witnessed death and tragedy on an unimaginable scale simply will not let go of its past? What happens when more people have died aboard a single vessel than on any other passenger ship still afloat, and their stories, their final moments, their unfinished business become woven into the very fabric of her being? The answer waits in the shadows, patient as the tide. The shipyard at Clydebank, Scotland had always been a place of noise and movement, where the ring of hammers against steel created a symphony of industry that echoed across the River Clyde. But in 1930, as the world slumped deeper into economic despair, those sounds began to fade. The Great Depression had strangled commerce, dried up trade routes, and left millions without work or hope. Yet it was here, in this landscape of unemployment and hunger, that one of history's most magnificent and allegedly cursed vessels would rise from the slipway. The ship that would become known as the Queen Mary began her life as hull number 534. And from the very beginning, she seemed to demand a price in human suffering that many would come to believe marked her as forever tainted. John Brown and Company Shipyard had secured the contract to build what would be the largest ocean liner the world had ever seen, a floating palace designed to restore Britain's dominance of the Atlantic and compete with the grand vessels being launched by other nations. The project represented hope in an age of darkness, employment in a time of joblessness, and pride for a country whose empire still stretched around the globe. Thousands of Scottish workers poured into Clydebank, desperate for wages that might feed their families. These were skilled craftsmen and laborers who understood that shipbuilding was dangerous work even in the best of times, but the Depression had stripped away the luxury of caution. Men took risks they might otherwise have avoided because the alternative was watching their children go hungry. The deaths began almost immediately. On the 7th of December, 1930, construction worker John MacDonald fell from scaffolding while working on the ship's hull. His body plummeted more than 60 feet before striking the ground, and he died hours later from his injuries. He would not be the last. Over the next 6 years of construction, the Queen Mary consumed lives with what some workers began to whisper was an unnatural hunger. Men fell from heights, were crushed between massive steel plates, succumbed to toxic fumes in poorly ventilated compartments, or were struck by falling equipment. The official death toll during construction varies depending on the source, with conservative estimates placing it at more than 24 men, while some historians and former workers claim the true number was closer to 50 or even higher. The shipyard culture of the era discouraged reporting accidents that might slow production or raise questions about safety standards. Families received modest compensation, bodies were buried, and the work continued. But among the laborers who climbed into that growing hull each morning, stories began to circulate. Some men reported hearing screams echoing through empty sections of the ship where no one else was working. Others spoke of tools that went missing only to reappear in impossible locations, or of cold spots in certain compartments that seemed to absorb warmth from the air itself. A welder named Thomas McNulty later told reporters that he'd seen the shadow of a falling man pass across his work area, causing him to leap backward in terror, only to find nothing above him and no one nearby who could have cast such a shadow. The build faced another crisis in December of 1931, when funding ran out and construction ground to a halt. The half-finished hull sat silent and rusting on the slipway for nearly 3 years, a monument to economic failure visible from all across Clydebank. More than 3,000 workers were laid off, plunging families back into poverty and desperation. Some say those years of abandonment, when the unfinished ship sat exposed to Scottish wind and rain, allowed something to settle into her bones, some quality of despair and suffering that soaked into the metal itself. When work finally resumed in April of 1934, funded by a government loan designed to stimulate employment, workers returning to the vessel reported that the atmosphere aboard had changed. The ship felt different now, heavier somehow, as if those years of stillness had allowed her to become aware of herself. The Queen Mary was finally launched on the 26th of September 1934, in a ceremony attended by King George V and Queen Mary herself, for whom the vessel was named. Even this moment of triumph carried tragedy. As the ship began to slide down the slipway toward the River Clyde, the massive displacement of water created a wave that surged along the riverbank. The wave struck spectators who had gathered to watch the launch, and in the chaos that followed, at least one person was killed and dozens were injured. The Queen Mary had claimed lives before she ever touched the water. When she entered service in May of 1936, all talk of curses and darkness evaporated in the glow of her magnificence. The Queen Mary was breathtaking, a masterpiece of Art Deco design with first-class cabins paneled in rare woods from across the British Empire. Her main dining room could seat 700 guests beneath a ceiling of impossibly intricate molded plaster. The Grand Salon featured a massive map of the Atlantic Ocean, where a model of the ship tracked her progress across the sea. Walking her decks was like entering a floating city where champagne flowed freely, where Hollywood stars and European aristocrats danced until dawn, and where the music of full orchestras drifted through smoke-filled lounges. Clark Gable sailed aboard her, as did Fred Astaire, Greta Garbo, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. She carried the wealthy and powerful across the Atlantic in unmatched luxury, breaking speed records and capturing the prestigious Blue Riband for the fastest crossing. For several years, the Queen Mary represented everything beautiful and optimistic about human achievement. But that golden era was about to end in a way that would forever alter the ship's character and cement her reputation as a vessel of death. When Britain declared war on Germany in September of 1939, the Queen Mary was in New York Harbor. Rather than risk the journey home through waters now prowled by German U-boats, she remained in port for months while military planners debated her fate. The decision was made to convert her into a troopship, and the transformation was brutal. Her luxurious interiors were stripped away or covered over. Standy bunks were installed in every available space, stacked 6 high in rooms that had once held a few privileged passengers. Her exterior was painted a dull gray color designed to make her difficult to spot against foggy seas and overcast skies. She became known as the Gray Ghost, and she began carrying soldiers to war. The numbers were staggering. Designed to carry just over 2,000 passengers, the Queen Mary now regularly transported 15,000 troops or more on a single voyage. Men slept in shifts because there weren't enough bunks. They stood in lines for hours waiting to use latrines or to receive meals. The luxury liner had become a crowded, uncomfortable, and increasingly dangerous environment. But her speed remained her greatest asset. Capable of maintaining 28 knots or faster, she could outrun the U-boats that hunted in wolf packs beneath the Atlantic. She traveled without escort through much of the war, relying on her velocity and zigzag course patterns to avoid torpedoes. The soldiers packed into her hull were not merely passengers traveling in discomfort. They were young men being transported toward battlefields where many would die. The Queen Mary carried them in her gray belly through submarine-infested waters and the psychological weight of that journey soaked into every rivet and weld. Imagine being one of 15,000 men crammed into a ship, knowing that a single torpedo strike would likely send you to the bottom with no hope of rescue. Imagine the fear, the seasickness, the crushing claustrophobia, the awareness that you were sailing toward possible death. That emotional residue, multiplied by the hundreds of thousands of troops she carried over years of war, created a psychological imprint that some researchers believe can linger in physical spaces. Then came the 2nd of October 1942, a date that would mark the Queen Mary with the single worst tragedy in her history. She was returning to Britain carrying thousands of American troops, accompanied by a destroyer escort named HMS Curacoa. The Curacoa was following a zigzag anti-submarine pattern ahead of the larger ship when, in a moment of catastrophic miscalculation, the two vessels found themselves on a collision course. The Queen Mary, weighing more than 80,000 tons and traveling at nearly 30 knots, struck the destroyer amidships. The Curacoa was sliced in half as cleanly as if struck by a giant axe. The two halves of the destroyer sank within minutes. 338 men were aboard HMS Curacoa when she was cut in two. Only 99 survived. 239 men died in the water that day, and this is where the horror deepens into something almost unbearable. Understanding wartime orders designed to protect troop ships from submarine attack, the Queen Mary could not stop. She could not slow down to rescue survivors. She could not turn back. To do so would risk the 15,000 American soldiers packed into her holds, making her a stationary target for any U-boat that might be lurking nearby. Captain Gordon Illingworth had no choice but to maintain speed and course, leaving the men of the Curacoa behind in the cold Atlantic water. Imagine standing at the stern of the Queen Mary and watching those men in the water, some swimming, some clinging to wreckage, some already dead, growing smaller and smaller as the ship powered away. Imagine being a sailor on that deck, knowing that you were leaving your countrymen to drown or freeze while you sailed to safety. Imagine being one of those men in the water, watching the massive gray hull of the Queen Mary disappear into the distance, understanding that you had been sacrificed according to the brutal mathematics of war. Other escort vessels eventually arrived and pulled 99 men from the sea, but 239 had already slipped beneath the waves. The psychological trauma of that event extended far beyond those directly involved. The American troops aboard the Queen Mary witnessed the collision and its aftermath. Officers and crew who understood what was happening were haunted by the decision to keep sailing. The families of the men who died received official notifications, but often little detail about how their loved ones had perished. And the Queen Mary herself, her bow damaged and stained with the destruction she had caused, continued her wartime service carrying that weight of death. Some of the crew reported hearing screaming men in the water during quiet night watches, even when the ship was in the middle of the Atlantic far from any other vessel. Others spoke of shadows that moved along the deck where the collision had been visible, silhouettes of men that vanished when approached. By the time the Second World War ended in 1945, the Queen Mary had transported more than 800,000 military personnel. She had traveled more than 600,000 miles during her wartime service. She had never been struck by a torpedo, never been caught by the U-boats that hunted her. She had survived the war intact, but she carried within her steel hull an accumulated weight of death and suffering that researchers into paranormal phenomena would later find impossible to ignore. Construction deaths, wartime trauma, the Curacoa collision, and the psychological residue of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors who had traveled aboard her while facing mortality. All of it had become part of the ship's identity. When she was finally retired from service and permanently docked in Long Beach, California in 1967, the Queen Mary was no longer merely a vessel. She had become something else, a container for decades of human emotion, tragedy, and death. The question that would haunt paranormal investigators and skeptics alike was whether all that suffering had somehow imprinted itself into the physical structure of the ship, creating the phenomena that countless witnesses would report in the decades to come. The first-class swimming pool on D-deck lies dormant now, a monument to faded grandeur and lingering tragedy. The last drops of chlorinated water were drained from this ornate space in 1967, yet something about this empty chamber refuses to rest quietly. Even now, Decades after the Queen Mary's final transatlantic voyage, this hollow rectangle of ceramic tile and oxidized brass continues to hold on to memories that refuse to dissolve into the past. The pool area stretches before visitors as an Art Deco masterpiece frozen in time. Its walls still showcase intricate tile work in geometric patterns of cream and turquoise, designed to evoke the glamour of an era when crossing the Atlantic meant weeks of luxury rather than hours of cramped air travel. The diving board stands at one end, its surface dulled by decades of salt air and neglect, pointing toward the empty depths below like a finger accusing the void. Brass railings, now tarnished to a murky green, curve along the edges where first-class passengers once gathered in plush robes, sipping cocktails and discussing the latest London theater or a New York society gossip. But the emptiness of the pool creates a peculiar acoustic quality, a resonance that seems to amplify rather than diminish the space's presence. Visitors who descend the narrow stairs to this level often report an immediate shift in atmosphere, a heaviness that settles over them like a damp towel draped across their shoulders. The air itself feels different here, thicker somehow, despite the absence of the steaming chlorinated water that once filled the pool during the ship's working years. The Queen Mary's records tell of 2 drownings in this very pool, separated by decades but eternally linked by the manner of their deaths and the persistence of their spirits. The first occurred during the 1930s, when the ship was still in her prime, cutting through Atlantic swells with the confidence of British engineering at its finest. A young woman, her name lost to time, or perhaps deliberately obscured by a company wishing to avoid scandal, slipped beneath the surface while swimming alone. Witnesses from that era reported seeing her in a distinctive blue bathing suit, a fashionable one-piece that marked her as someone of means and modern sensibilities. The circumstances surrounding her drowning remain murky. Some accounts suggest she suffered a sudden medical crisis, perhaps a stroke or heart attack. Others whisper of something more sinister, pointing to the suspicious absence of other swimmers despite it being the middle of a bustling afternoon crossing. The second drowning came decades later, in the 1960s, as the Queen Mary approached the end of her service as a luxury liner. Another woman, this one documented more thoroughly in incident reports, died in circumstances that echo the first tragedy with unsettling precision. She wore a white bathing suit, a detail that numerous crew members noted in their statements. Like her predecessor, she was found floating face down, having apparently drowned while swimming alone. The coroner's report cited accidental drowning, but crew members who had served on the ship for years spoke quietly among themselves about the strange repetition. The way history seemed to be folding back on itself in that tile-lined chamber beneath the decks. These 2 women, one in blue and one in white, have become permanent residents of the empty pool. Security guards working the overnight shifts report experiences that have driven some to request reassignment and others to quit outright. Marcus Chen, who worked security on the Queen Mary for 8 years before transferring to a shore-based position, describes an encounter that still causes his hands to shake when he recounts it. It was during a routine patrol at 3 in the morning, a time when the tourist vessel sits quiet and the long beach harbor outside falls into its deepest silence. Marcus descended the stairs to D-deck, following his usual route, when he heard the unmistakable sound of splashing water echoing from the pool area. The sound was not subtle or easy to dismiss. It was vigorous, purposeful splashing, the kind created by someone swimming laps with determined strokes. Marcus quickened his pace, assuming that a guest had somehow evaded the barriers and decided to explore the restricted area. As he approached, he could hear the splashing growing louder, more intense, accompanied by what sounded like someone breaking the surface to gasp for air. But when he entered the pool area and swept his flashlight across the empty basin, the sounds ceased instantly. The pool lay before him exactly as it always had, utterly dry, utterly empty. He stood there for several minutes, his flashlight beam tracking across the dusty floor of the pool, finding nothing but a few scattered leaves and some debris that had drifted in over the years. The silence that followed felt aggressive, like a door slamming in his face. Marcus completed his patrol quickly that night, and has never worked a graveyard shift on the ship again. Tour guides accumulate their own collections of inexplicable experiences in the pool area. Sarah Mendoza, who has led historical tours through the Queen Mary for over a decade, maintains a detailed journal of unusual occurrences. She describes the overwhelming smell of chlorine that periodically floods the pool area, so strong that it burns the nostrils and causes eyes to water. This happens despite the fact that no chlorine has been used in or near the pool since 1967. The smell arrives suddenly without warning and can last anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes before dissipating just as mysteriously. Sarah has brought tour groups into the area only to have every person simultaneously react to the sharp chemical odor, coughing and stepping back from the edge of the empty pool. When she radios maintenance to report a possible chemical spill, they find nothing. The smell exists and then vanishes, leaving no trace and no explanation. The humidity presents another persistent mystery. Guests and staff alike report walking into the pool area and immediately feeling as though they have stepped into a sauna. The air becomes thick with moisture, causing clothing to cling damply to skin and glasses to fog over. One visitor described it as feeling like the room was breathing, exhaling warm, wet air in rhythmic waves. Yet humidity sensors in the area register normal levels. The environmental controls for this section of the ship show no anomalies. The oppressive wetness exists only as a sensation, something felt but not measured, experienced but not explained. The wet footprints represent perhaps the most visually documented phenomenon associated with the pool. Multiple witnesses have photographed and video recorded damp footprints appearing on the deck surrounding the empty pool. These are not vague smudges or shadows that could be explained as tricks of light. They are distinct footprints, showing clear toe impressions and heel marks, tracking away from the edge of the pool as though someone has just climbed out and walked toward the changing rooms. The footprints appear most frequently in the early morning hours, though they have been witnessed at various times throughout the day and night. They fade gradually, evaporating over the course of a few minutes, but while they are present, they leave actual moisture that can be touched and felt. James Rourke, an overnight guest who booked one of the ship's hotel rooms as part of a paranormal investigation weekend, experienced the footprints along with something far more disturbing. He had positioned himself near the pool's edge at approximately 2 in the morning, camera equipment set up to capture any unusual activity. He watched as wet footprints materialized near the shallow end of the pool, appearing step by step as though invisible feet were creating them in real time. The prince walked directly toward him, and James describes a moment of paralysis as he watched them approach, unable to move or call out. When the invisible presence reached a point roughly 3 feet from where he stood, James felt hands against his chest. They were cold, impossibly cold, and soaking wet. The hands pushed hard, and James stumbled backward, tripping over his equipment bag and falling heavily onto the deck. By the time he scrambled to his feet, the footprints were already fading. He packed his equipment and left the pool area immediately, spending the remainder of the night in his stateroom with the door locked. Multiple other witnesses report similar experiences of being pushed or shoved by invisible hands when standing too close to the pool's edge. The sensation is always the same: cold, wet pressure against the chest or back, accompanied by a forceful shove. Some describe it as playful, like someone giving them a teasing push. Others characterize it as aggressive, a deliberate attempt to send them tumbling into the empty pool below. The intent, if such a thing can be assigned to paranormal activity, remains unclear. Are these the spirits of the drowned women trying to communicate, to warn, to share their fate with others? Or something else at work, some recording of past events playing on an endless loop, touching the present only tangentially? The apparitions themselves appear less frequently than the other phenomena, but when they do manifest, they are startlingly clear. The woman in the blue bathing suit has been seen standing at the deep end of the pool, her hair wet and plastered to her head, water streaming down her arms and legs despite standing in an empty basin. Witnesses describe her as appearing solid, three-dimensional, utterly real until she vanishes. The woman in the white bathing suit tends to appear near the changing room entrance, and unlike her counterpart, she seems aware of observers. Several people have reported making eye contact with her, seeing her face register surprise, or perhaps recognition, before she fades from view. Both apparitions appear predominantly to women, though male witnesses have reported sightings as well. They are always soaking wet, always silent, and always gone within moments of being seen. The psychological weight of the pool area affects even skeptics who visit the Queen Mary. There is something fundamentally unsettling about an empty swimming pool, something that triggers a deep unease in the human psyche. Pools are meant to be filled, to serve their purpose, to reflect light and host life. An empty pool becomes a void, a mouth open in an eternal silent scream, a vessel drained of its meaning. When you add the knowledge of death, of two women who breathed their last breaths while surrounded by water that should have been their pleasure but became their grave, the psychological impact intensifies. The pool becomes a memorial, whether intentionally or not, a space where tragedy has soaked into the very tile and grout. What keeps these spirits bound to this location? Perhaps drowning creates a particular kind of haunting, the terror and confusion of those final moments, imprinting themselves onto the physical space with unusual strength. Or perhaps the pool itself acts as a kind of battery, its unique acoustics and materials somehow recording and replaying the psychic energy of traumatic events. The Art Deco design, with its geometric precision and carefully calculated proportions, might create conditions we do not yet understand. An architecture that somehow traps more than echoes. The Queen Mary's first-class pool stands as a testament to mysteries that resist easy explanation. It challenges our understanding of how the past interacts with the present, how tragedy leaves marks that time cannot erase. The splashing continues in the absence of water. The footprints appear where no feet tread. The women in their bathing suits, blue and white, remain eternally caught between worlds, forever swimming in a pool that no longer holds them, yet can never let them go. Deep in the bowels of the Queen Mary, past the gleaming tourist corridors and carefully preserved staterooms, there exists a place where the ship's elegant facade gives way to something far more ominous. The engine room is a cathedral of steel and shadow, a labyrinth of pipes, valves, and massive machinery that once powered this great vessel across the Atlantic. And here, near watertight door number 13, the past refuses to die. On the 10th of July, 1966, the Queen Mary was no longer a working ocean liner, but a tourist attraction, newly docked in Long Beach, California. The conversion process was underway, transforming the Grand Lady of the Seas into a floating museum and hotel. But her mechanical systems still required testing, and drills still needed to be conducted to ensure everything functioned properly. On that particular summer day, 18-year-old fireman John Petter reported for duty, just another routine shift in what should have been an unremarkable job. The watertight doors that lined the Queen Mary's lower decks were engineering marvels of their time, designed to save the ship in case of hull breach or flooding. These massive steel barriers, weighing nearly 300 pounds each, could slam shut in mere seconds, creating airtight seals that would compartmentalize the vessel and prevent it from sinking. When activated, they descended from their housing with brutal efficiency, powered by hydraulics that had been designed for one purpose: to close completely and absolutely, no matter what stood in their way. They were not built with safety features or sensors. They were built to seal, and seal they did. Door number 13 was located in a particularly cramped section of the engine room, where pipes and machinery crowded the narrow corridor. The ceiling hung low, and the perpetual smell of oil and grease permeated the air. It was hot down there, always hot, with the residual warmth from decades of roaring engines still seeming to radiate from the very walls. On that July day, a routine drill was called. The watertight doors would be tested, closed and opened in sequence to ensure they remained operational. John Petter, young and perhaps still learning the rhythms of the ship, was near door 13 when the alarm sounded. What happened next occurred in the space of heartbeats. Some reports suggest he was attempting to pass through the doorway as the drill began. Others claim he was working on something just beneath where the door would descend. What remains undisputed is the horrific outcome. The massive steel door came crashing down, and John Petter was caught directly in its path. The crushing force was instantaneous and absolute. The door, designed to seal against the pressure of the ocean itself, showed no mercy. By the time someone hit the emergency stop, by the time the hydraulics hissed and the door halted its descent, it was far too late. John Petter died there, in that narrow corridor, his body broken by the very mechanism meant to protect the ship. He was 18 years old, barely a man, his life snuffed out in seconds by tons of descending steel. The mechanical horror of his death cannot be overstated. This was not a gentle passing or a quick accident. This was a brutal, crushing force meeting human flesh and bone, a death of immense trauma and unimaginable pain. The image of that door, that particular door number 13, became forever seared into the consciousness of everyone who worked in the Queen Mary's depth. They cleaned the area. They repaired what needed repairing, and life went on. But something remained. It started with small things, easy to dismiss. A shadow glimpsed in peripheral vision. A sound that didn't quite match the normal groans and creaks of the aging ship. But as the years passed, and the Queen Mary settled into her new role as a tourist attraction, the reports began to accumulate, growing more detailed and more disturbing. Workers in the engine room spoke of a presence, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. And then came the sightings. He appears as a young man, barely more than a boy, wearing blue coveralls stained with grease and oil. His appearance is most often reported near door 13, that fatal threshold where he lost his life. Witnesses describe him as solid and real, at least at first glance, real enough that some have mistaken him for a living person and called out a greeting or a warning. But he never responds with words. Sometimes he simply stares, his face bearing an expression that those who have seen it struggle to describe. Confusion, perhaps, or a kind of eternal surprise, as if he is forever caught in that last moment before the door came down, before everything ended. The smell comes with him. Multiple witnesses, separated by years and with no knowledge of each other's experiences, report the same specific detail. The sudden, overwhelming scent of grease and motor oil, far stronger than the ambient smell of the engine room. It arrives without warning, thick and cloying, filling the nostrils and seeming to coat the back of the throat. And with it comes a drop in temperature, a sudden chill that has no business existing in the perpetually warm depths of the ship. Those who experience it describe a cold that seems to penetrate to the bone, a wrongness in the air that makes the hair stand up on the back of the neck. Engineering staff and maintenance workers have compiled an informal list of incidents over the decades, stories passed down from veteran employees to nervous newcomer. There's the maintenance worker who, in 1987, was performing a routine inspection near door 13 when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned, expecting to see a colleague, but the corridor was empty. The footsteps continued, passing right by him, close enough that he should have been able to reach out and touch whoever was making them. He reported feeling a rush of cold air as the invisible presence moved past, and that unmistakable smell of grease filled his nostrils. He left the engine room and refused to return alone. There's the engineer who, in the early 2000s, was working late on the ship's electrical systems. The engine room was supposed to be empty, all tours finished for the night, all other workers gone home. He was deep in concentration, troubleshooting a problem, when he became aware of someone standing behind him. He could feel eyes on his back, that undeniable sensation of being observed. When he turned around, he saw the young man in blue coveralls, standing perhaps 10 feet away, simply watching him. The engineer froze, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then the figure turned and walked toward door 13, and as the engineer watched, the young man in coveralls walked straight through the solid steel door and vanished. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports of door 13 activating on its own. This has happened multiple times over the years, witnessed by numerous people. The door, which should be firmly locked in the open position, which has been disconnected from the ship's power systems, which has every mechanical reason to remain stationary, will suddenly begin to move. Witnesses describe hearing the groan of metal, the hiss of hydraulics that shouldn't be functioning, and watching in horror as the massive door begins its descent. Sometimes it drops only a few inches before stopping. Other times it closes completely, sealing the corridor with a sound like a tomb being shut. Engineers have examined the door repeatedly. They've checked the mechanisms, verified the disconnected power sources, searched for any logical explanation. They find nothing that would account for these activations. The door should not move. It cannot move, according to every principle of mechanical engineering. Yet, it does. Many workers now refuse to enter that section of the engine room alone. It's an unspoken rule among the maintenance staff, a policy born not from official decree, but from collective experience and primal fear. Even skeptics, those who arrive scoffing at ghost stories, often find themselves changed after spending time in that corridor. There's something about the place, they say, something fundamentally wrong. The air feels heavier there. The shadows seem darker. And always, there is that sensation of being watched, of invisible eyes tracking your every movement. Some paranormal researchers believe that violent, sudden deaths create what they call residual hauntings, impressions stamped onto a location by the extreme trauma and fear of the final moment. The theory suggests that consciousness, at the moment of unexpected death, releases a burst of energy that can imprint itself on the surrounding environment. If this is true, then few deaths would qualify more than John Petter's crushing beneath that massive door. The shock, the terror, the instantaneous transition from life to death, all of it happening in that tiny, cramped corridor. Some researchers go further, suggesting that such traumatic deaths can create vortexes of psychic energy, thin places where the barrier between past and present grows permeable. Whether John Petter himself haunts Door 13, or whether the location simply replays the trauma of that July day in 1966 like a recording stuck on repeat, remains a matter of interpretation. But the experiences of those who work and visit that section of the ship suggest that something persists there, some echo or remnant that refuses to fade. The Queen Mary offers engine room tours now, and Door 13 has become one of the most photographed locations on the ship. Visitors crowd into that narrow corridor, cameras ready, hoping to capture something unexplained. Most leave disappointed, seeing only old machinery and steel walls. But some, a persistent few, report that familiar sequence. The sudden cold, the smell of grease, the feeling of being watched. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone catches a glimpse of a young man in blue coveralls, forever 18, forever trapped in the place where his life ended in crushing, mechanical horror. The door stands open now, locked in position, a silent monument to the dangers that once existed in this industrial heart of the ship. But those who know the stories, those who have felt the presence, approach it with caution and respect. Because deep in the engine room of the Queen Mary, near watertight door number 13, the past is never quite past, and John Petter may still be walking his eternal rounds, forever the young fireman who never made it home from his shift on that summer day, so many decades ago. The ocean liner cuts through dark Atlantic waters, carrying within its Art Deco splendor a secret that has been locked away for more than half a century. Deep in the belly of the ship, along a corridor that once hosted the world's elite travelers, there exists a cabin that has witnessed something so terrible, so violent, that for decades the shipping company refused to acknowledge its existence. Stateroom B340 was sealed, removed from all booking systems, its number skipped over as if it had never been. The door locked, the room forgotten, or at least, that was the intention. To understand why this particular cabin carries such a dark reputation, we must travel back to 1947, to a crossing that began like any other. The ship was packed with passengers eager to leave post-war Europe behind, seeking new beginnings across the ocean. Among them was a man whose name has been conspicuously scrubbed from official records, though crew members who worked that voyage would later whisper it in hushed tones. He had booked Stateroom B340, a modest but comfortable cabin designed for 1 or 2 passengers. According to these unofficial accounts, he traveled with a woman, though whether she was his wife, his mistress, or simply an acquaintance remains unclear. What is known, pieced together from fragmentary crew testimonies and passenger gossip that survived in letters and diaries, is that something horrific happened behind that cabin door during the 3rd night at sea. A steward making his morning rounds reported hearing what he described as furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by a woman's scream that was abruptly cut short. When he knocked on the door, there was no answer. When he used his master key to enter, he found the cabin in complete disarray. Chairs were overturned. A lamp lay shattered on the floor. The bedding had been torn from the mattress. And there, according to these second-hand accounts, was evidence of violence. Blood on the wall. More blood soaked into the carpet. But no bodies. No sign of either passenger. The official ship's log from that crossing makes no mention of any incident in Cabin B340. There is no record of a police investigation when the ship docked. No newspaper accounts exist of a murder at sea during that particular voyage. It is as if someone decided that whatever happened in that cabin would be better left unrecorded, uninvestigated, and most importantly, unremembered. Yet the crew knew, they always know, and they began to avoid that corridor when possible, especially at night. Within months of the alleged incident, strange reports began to surface. A passenger booked into B340 complained of being unable to sleep, claiming that someone was pacing back and forth in the cabin throughout the night, though they were alone. Another guest reported that the temperature in the room would drop suddenly and without warning, their breath misting in the air despite the ship's heating system working perfectly. These complaints were easy enough to dismiss as the imaginings of nervous travelers unused to life at sea. But then came the night in 1952 when a young couple on their honeymoon fled the cabin at 3 in the morning, hammering on the purser's door, demanding to be moved to any other accommodation on the ship. The bride's neck bore vivid red marks, as if someone had attempted to strangle her. She was hysterical, barely able to speak, while her husband, a decorated war veteran who had seen combat in the Pacific, was visibly shaking. They both insisted that they had been attacked by an invisible presence. The new husband reported waking to find his wife being lifted off the bed by her throat, her legs kicking frantically, her hands clawing at something he could not see. When he lunged forward to help her, he felt hands, solid and strong and unmistakably real, push him backward with tremendous force. Only when he began shouting and turning on all the lights did the attack stop, his wife dropping back onto the bed, gasping for air. The shipping company quietly refunded their passage and asked them to sign a document agreeing not to discuss the incident publicly. The cabin was taken out of service for inspection. Nothing unusual was found. No faulty wiring that might cause strange sensations. No gas leaks. No structural issues. Just a perfectly ordinary cabin that now carried an extraordinary reputation. Through the 1960s and 70s, B340 was used occasionally when the ship was fully booked and there was simply no alternative. Each time, the results were the same. Guests would report phenomena that went far beyond the typical creaks and groans of an aging vessel. They spoke of bed covers being violently ripped away in the middle of the night, furniture that moved on its own, chairs scraping across the floor with no one touching them, the sound of angry shouting, a man's voice bellowing words that could not quite be made out, coming from inside the cabin when it was known to be empty. And most disturbing of all, the sensation of a malevolent presence, a palpable rage that seemed to saturate the very air of that small space. A stewardess working the ship in 1973 later recounted her experience entering the cabin to prepare it for new guests. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt what she described as a wall of hostility, an anger so intense it made her physically ill. The temperature was ice cold, despite a warm spring day. As she began to make the bed, she heard breathing behind her, heavy and masculine. When she turned, there was no one there. Then the cabin door slammed shut with such force that it splintered the wooden frame. She ran, leaving her cleaning cart behind, and refused to ever enter that cabin again, even when threatened with dismissal. By 1980, the decision was made at the corporate level. Stateroom B340 would be permanently sealed. The official reason given was structural concerns, though no repairs were ever scheduled or performed. The cabin was simply locked, its number removed from deck plans, the space officially forgotten. For nearly 4 decades, it sat empty while the ship continued its service, later becoming a permanently docked hotel and museum. The room became legend among the crew, a ghost story told to new employees, a dare whispered among braver staff members, who would press their ears to the locked door late at night, claiming to hear movement within. Then came 2018, and a new management team with a different philosophy. The ship had embraced its haunted reputation, offering ghost tours and paranormal investigations to curious visitors. Someone suggested that Cabin B340, the most notorious space on the entire vessel, should be reopened. Not as a regular guest room, but as what they called a paranormal investigation suite. A place where people specifically seeking supernatural experiences could spend the night, equipped with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to document whatever dark presence had been locked away for so many years. The door was unsealed. The cabin was cleaned and minimally furnished with period-appropriate pieces from the 1940s. And the bookings began. What followed has created a growing file of incident reports that the ship's management can no longer easily dismiss or hide. A paranormal investigation team from California spent 3 nights in the cabin in late 2018. Their video footage shows objects moving on camera. A chair sliding several feet across the floor. A hairbrush flying off the dresser and striking the wall. But more disturbing were the personal experiences. The team leader, a skeptic who had debunked numerous supposedly haunted locations, woke on the second night to find scratch marks running down his chest. 3 parallel gouges that had drawn blood. The wounds appeared while he slept, captured on infrared camera as 3 red lines that simply materialized on his skin, as if an invisible hand had clawed him. Others have reported hearing the voice, always masculine, always angry. Some describe it as shouting, though the words remain unclear, muffled as if coming through water. Others say it whispers, close to their ear in the darkness, speaking threats in a language or accent they cannot identify. The voice seems to come from different locations in the cabin, sometimes from the corner near the porthole, other times from directly beside the bed. The most frequently reported phenomenon is the figure. Guests describe waking in the night to see a man standing at the foot of the bed. He wears clothing from the 1940s, a suit that witnesses say looks expensive, though dated. His face is described as twisted with rage, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark, and filled with what one guest called bottomless fury. He does not move. He does not speak. He simply stands there, radiating anger, until the terrified witness either turns on a light or runs from the room. When they look again, he is gone. A woman who stayed in the cabin in 2019 reported waking to find this figure looming over her. So close, she could have touched him. She described feeling his breath on her face, cold and smelling of decay. When she tried to scream, no sound would come. She felt paralyzed, unable to move, as the figure's hands reached toward her throat. Only when her boyfriend, sleeping beside her, suddenly woke and sat up did the figure vanish. She left the cabin with bruises on her neck in the shape of fingerprints. The rage is what everyone mentions. Not just fear or unease, but a specific, focused anger that seems to permeate every surface of that small cabin. Psychologists might explain it as suggestion, the power of expectation creating perceived experiences. But the consistency of the reports, spanning decades, from people who often knew nothing of the cabin's history before entering, suggests something more difficult to dismiss. The violent outbursts, the physical attacks, the overwhelming sense that whatever presence inhabits Cabin B340 does not simply want to frighten. It wants to hurt. The ship's management now requires guests staying in the cabin to sign extensive liability waivers. They are offered the opportunity to leave at any time, with a full refund, no questions asked. Many do. Some make it through a single night. A very few manage to stay for the full experience they have booked. Almost all leave with stories that they struggle to rationalize, experiences that challenge their understanding of what is possible. The murder, if it happened, was never solved. The man who may have killed in that cabin was never identified or brought to justice. And so perhaps he remains, trapped in the scene of his crime, reliving his rage over and over, lashing out at anyone unfortunate enough to enter his domain. In the darkness of Cabin B340, the past refuses to stay buried, and the dead, it seems, refuse to rest. The laughter echoes down the empty corridor at 2:30 in the morning, high and bright and utterly wrong. It sounds exactly like children at play, carefree and delighted, except there are no children aboard the Queen Mary at this hour. There haven't been for decades. But the laughter continues regardless, bouncing off the Art Deco walls, weaving through the passages that once carried families on their journey across the Atlantic. This is perhaps the most disturbing phenomenon reported on the ship, not because it's violent or threatening, but because it's so achingly innocent. The spirits of children, forever young, forever playing, forever trapped in an eternal game they don't understand, has no end. The second-class swimming pool sits empty now. Drained since 1967, its tiles cracked and stained with age. The changing rooms smell of mildew and salt air that somehow penetrates even here, deep in the ship's belly. During the day, tourists file through, snapping photographs, their voices creating artificial life in a space that feels suspended in time. But at night, when the tour groups have departed and the gift shops have closed, the pool area transforms into something else entirely. Security guards report the sound of splashing water echoing from a pool that contains nothing but air and memories. The acoustics are perfect for it, they say. The tile walls amplify every sound, which makes the phantom noises even more unsettling when they begin. Jackie is the name given to the most frequently encountered spirit in the pool area, though no one knows for certain who he was in life or if that was actually his name. According to the stories that staff members share in hushed tones during quiet shifts, Jackie was a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and clothing that suggests the 1930s or 40s. The accounts describe him as appearing near the shallow end of the pool, often sitting on the edge with his legs dangling over the side, swinging back and forth, as children do when they're waiting for something interesting to happen. What makes Jackie's presence particularly haunting is his interaction with the living. Unlike the violent entities reported in the engine room or the threatening presence in the first-class swimming pool, Jackie seems genuinely lonely. Security personnel working the night shift have reported encounters where a young boy's voice asks them a simple question that chills them to their core. "Will you play with me?" The voice sounds hopeful, even eager, as though the child has been waiting for someone, anyone to acknowledge him and relieve the endless boredom of his existence. One security guard, a former Navy veteran who worked on the ship for over a decade before requesting reassignment to different duties, described his encounter with particular clarity. He had been conducting his rounds through the pool area shortly after midnight on a Tuesday in late October. "That felt heavy," he recalled. Thick in a way that had nothing to do with humidity. As he swept his flashlight across the empty pool, he heard small footsteps behind him, the distinctive slap of bare feet on wet tile. When he turned, there was nothing there, but the footsteps continued, circling around him in the darkness beyond his flashlight's beam. Then came the voice, directly beside him, though he could see no one. "Do you want to swim?" the voice asked. "It's really fun." The guard left immediately, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work his radio to call for backup. The theory that Jackie drowned in the second-class pool has never been conclusively proven. Ship records from the Queen Mary's operational years are extensive but not complete. Deaths aboard ocean liners were carefully documented, especially those involving children, as they often triggered investigations and potential liability issues. Yet no clear record exists of a boy drowning in this particular pool during the ship's years of service. Some researchers suggest that if such a drowning occurred, it might have been hushed up to avoid scandal or panic among passengers. Others theorize that Jackie might have died elsewhere on the ship and simply attached himself to the pool area, because it represented play and happiness, the things a child would naturally gravitate toward even in death. What makes the child hauntings throughout the Queen Mary especially tragic is the possibility that these young spirits don't understand their own condition. Child psychologists and paranormal researchers who've studied the phenomena of child spirits often note that young children, especially those under 10 years old, have an incomplete understanding of death as a permanent state. To a child, especially one from an era before modern media saturated young minds with images of mortality, death might seem like just another form of play, another adventure, another game that will eventually end when their parents call them home. The third-class nursery presents another heartbreaking manifestation of this phenomenon. Located in a section of the ship that housed families traveling in the most economical accommodations, the nursery was designed to give mothers a place to care for their infants and very young children during the voyage. Today, it's been partially converted into storage and office space, the original cribs and changing tables long since removed. But something remains there, something that manifests most frequently in the early morning hours between 3 and 5 a.m. Staff members who've worked in or near the former nursery space report the unmistakable sound of an infant crying. Not the angry wail of a hungry or uncomfortable baby, but the softer, more desperate cry of a child who wants to be held and comforted. The sound moves through the space, they say, as though someone is walking back and forth trying to soothe the crying infant, pacing the way exhausted parents do at 3 in the morning when nothing else seems to work. But when investigators follow the sound, they find empty rooms with no source for the noise. The crying continues, indifferent to their presence, lost in its own private anguish. Temperature drops accompany these auditory phenomena. In the nursery area, multiple witnesses have documented sudden cold spots that move through the space like invisible currents. Thermographic cameras have captured temperature fluctuations of 15 to 20 degrees, in localized areas no larger than 3 feet across, cold zones that drift slowly along the paths where nurses would have walked while caring for the children in their charge. The scientific explanation might involve air circulation patterns and the ship's aging ventilation system. But those who've experienced these cold spots firsthand describe them as feeling distinctly different from ordinary drafts. The cold feels intentional, they say, as though something is drawing warmth from the environment to manifest itself more fully. Throughout the ship's various corridors, particularly those that once served as passageways for families with children, security cameras have captured anomalies that investigators struggle to explain conventionally. Orbs of light, often dismissed by skeptics as dust particles or lens flares, appear with unusual frequency in areas associated with children. More disturbing are the instances where these lights seem to move with purpose, traveling at heights consistent with a young child running, weaving back and forth across corridors as though playing chase or tag with invisible friend. The handprints present perhaps the most tangible evidence of child spirits aboard the Queen Mary. Throughout the ship, but especially in areas near the pools and former nursery, small handprints appear on mirrors, glass partitions, and polished metal surfaces. These prints are distinctly smaller than adult hands, with finger spacing and palm proportions consistent with children between the ages of 4 and 10 years old. The prints appear despite regular cleaning, manifesting overnight on surfaces that were wiped down and polished just hours before. One housekeeper documented over 30 instances of these handprints appearing in the same mirror near the second-class pool area over the course of a single year. She would clean the mirror thoroughly each morning, removing any smudges or marks, only to find new small handprints the next day, always at child height, always pressed against the glass as though someone small was trying to see their reflection or peer through to the other side. The pattern never varied. The prints would appear low on the mirror, between 3 and 4 feet from the floor, exactly where a young child standing before the mirror would place their hands. What elevates these handprints beyond simple unexplained phenomena is their context. They don't appear randomly throughout the ship. They cluster in specific locations that all share a common history of being spaces where children gathered and played during the Queen Mary's years of active service. The pools, the nursery, the children's playroom, the corridors that led to family cabins. It's as though the spirits are drawn to these spaces by memory, by the echo of happiness they knew there, unable to understand that the other children have grown up and moved on, or that they themselves are no longer part of the living world. Paranormal investigators who subscribe to the stone tape theory, which suggests that traumatic or emotionally significant events can be recorded in the environment and played back under certain conditions, find themselves challenged by the interactive nature of these child hauntings. The stone tape theory works well for explaining residual hauntings, repetitive phenomena that seem more like recordings than actual spirit interactions. But Jackie asking if you'll play with him, or the handprints appearing in new configurations each day, or the crying that responds to human presence by growing louder or softer, these suggest something more than mere playback. These suggest consciousness, awareness, intention. The alternative explanation is even more haunting. These might be intelligent hauntings, the genuine spirits of children who died aboard the ship or who formed such strong attachments to it during life that they returned after death. If this is true, then these children exist in a state of perpetual confusion, unable to comprehend why the ship never reaches port, why their parents never come to collect them, why the other children they remember playing with have all disappeared. They continue their routines, playing their games, waiting for something they lack the understanding to realize will never come. Former crew members who worked the Queen Mary during her final years of ocean service, before she was permanently docked in Long Beach, occasionally share stories that might provide context for these hauntings. During the Second World War, when the ship served as a trooper transport nicknamed the Gray Ghost, she carried not only soldiers but also refugees, war brides and their children fleeing war-torn Europe for the safety of America. The crossings were dangerous, pursued by German U-boats, the ship sailing without escort because her speed was her only defense. Children who made those crossings lived in constant fear, their parents unable to fully shield them from the knowledge that each day at sea might be their last. Did some of those children's fear imprint so strongly on the ship that it persists decades later? Or did tragedy strike in ways never fully recorded, illnesses, or accidents that claimed young lives during those chaotic wartime voyages, when proper documentation sometimes fell by the wayside in the urgency of simply surviving the crossing. The psychological impact of encountering child spirits differs markedly from experiencing other forms of haunting. Adult ghosts, even violent or threatening ones, fit into certain narrative frameworks we understand. We can rationalize them as products of trauma, violence, unfinished business. But child ghosts shatter our comfortable assumptions about death and the afterlife. We want to believe that children, innocents, are protected somehow, that they move on to something better, that they don't linger in confusion and isolation. The presence of child spirits aboard the Queen Mary forces us to confront the possibility that death plays no favorites, shows no mercy based on age, and that some souls become trapped regardless of their innocence or youth. The staff members who work aboard the Queen Mary and regularly encounter these child spirits often develop complicated relationships with them. Unlike the entities that inspire pure fear, the child spirits evoke sadness, protective instincts, even a desire to help them somehow. Several employees have admitted to speaking softly to empty rooms in the nursery area, trying to comfort whatever creates those crying sounds. Security guards have been known to leave small toys near the pool area, gifts for Jackie, though they know he can never truly play with them. These gestures may be futile, but they represent something fundamentally human, our need to nurture and protect children, even when those children no longer exist in any conventional sense. As you walk through the Queen Mary today, through the silent corridors and empty pools, past mirrors that might bear small handprints by morning, remember that not all ghosts inspire fear. Some inspire heartbreak. Somewhere in the shadows of this great ship, children continue their endless games, waiting for playmates who will never come, for parents who can never retrieve them, trapped in an eternal childhood that has become not a blessing, but a prison from which there is no escape. The bow of the Queen Mary sits in perpetual shadow, even on the brightest Southern California days. Here, in the forward sections of the ship where the hull curves to meet the sea, a place exists that even the most skeptical security guards refuse to patrol alone. The Isolation Ward, a name that carries within it the weight of 1,000 desperate prayers that went unanswered. During the ship's glory years as a transatlantic liner, this area served a necessary but grim purpose. When passengers fell ill with contagious diseases mid-crossing, they were brought here, separated from the healthy, placed behind locked doors in the deepest sections of the bow. Smallpox, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and diseases whose names we've nearly forgotten turned this corridor into a prison of suffering. The sick were isolated not just from other passengers, but from hope itself. 5 days from shore in either direction, with no modern antibiotics, no advanced medical intervention. Many who entered these rooms never left them alive. The geography of the isolation ward tells its own story of despair. Located in the bow, these quarters experience the most violent motion of the ship, the constant rise and fall as the vessel cut through Atlantic swells. Imagine lying feverish and dying, your body racked with disease, while the floor beneath you pitches and rolls without cease. The sounds of the ocean pressing against the hull plates just feet away, a constant reminder of how far from land you truly were. The metal walls sweating with condensation, cold to the touch regardless of the temperature outside. This was where hope came to die. The physical space remains largely unchanged from those dark days. The narrow corridors seem to press in from both sides, creating an immediate sense of claustrophobia that intensifies with each step forward. The ceiling hangs low, designed for functionality rather than comfort. Original fixtures still line the walls, though now they're dark, disconnected from power sources. The rooms themselves are small, barely larger than prison cells, with portholes that look out onto nothing but gray water and grayer sky. But the physical oppressiveness of the space pales in comparison to what people feel when they enter. Every person who has spent time in the isolation ward describes the same sensations with eerie consistency. A weight pressing down on their chest, making each breath slightly more difficult than it should be. A coldness that settles into their bones within minutes, even when the temperature reads perfectly normal on thermometers. And most disturbing of all, an overwhelming sense of despair so profound that it feels like drowning. a crushing certainty that something terrible is about to happen, and there is no escape. The cold spots in the isolation ward defy every rational explanation. Paranormal investigators have documented temperature drops of 20 to 30 degrees within a single footstep, invisible boundaries between normal air and zones of inexplicable cold. These aren't gradual transitions but sharp demarcations, as if walking through a curtain of ice. The cold isn't uniform either. Some describe it as a damp cold, like the air in a tomb. Others report a feverish cold, the kind that makes you shiver even as you sweat. Thermal imaging cameras capture these anomalies as dark blue voids in otherwise red and orange rooms, pockets of impossible cold that move and shift, sometimes appearing to follow investigators as they work. The apparitions witnessed in the isolation ward are unlike the playful spirits or residual hauntings reported elsewhere on the ship. These are full-bodied manifestations of human suffering, so detailed and solid that witnesses initially mistake them for living people. They appear most often in the early morning hours, between 2 and 4 a.m., though the isolation ward exists in such perpetual gloom that time seems almost meaningless there. Security personnel describe encounters that have driven more than one guard to resign. They round a corner and see a figure standing at the end of the corridor, swaying slightly with the remembered motion of waves from decades past. The figures wear the clothing of another era, sometimes hospital gowns, sometimes the formal wear they boarded the ship wearing before illness struck. Their faces are the most disturbing element. Pale beyond the pallor of the living, sheened with fever sweat, with eyes that hold an awareness of their own suffering. These spirits don't simply replay moments from the past. They see the living. They react to them. And sometimes they reach out. One security supervisor, a former military police officer who prided himself on his rational skepticism, reported walking through the isolation ward during a routine patrol in 2007. He heard coughing echoing from one of the sealed rooms, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of lungs failing in their basic function. Following protocol, he unlocked the door, certain he would find an intruder or perhaps a malfunction in the old ventilation system. The room was empty, but as he stood in the doorway, the coughing continued, coming from a specific corner where shadows seemed to gather more thickly than elsewhere. Then he heard breathing, labored and painful, and watched as the impression of a body appeared on the old mattress still stored in the room. The indentation deepened, as if under increasing weight, the ancient springs creaking in protest. He backed out of the room and refused to patrol that section alone ever again. The sounds are relentless in the isolation ward. Coughing, always coughing, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Moaning that rises and falls like a tide of agony. Whispered prayers in languages and accents from around the world, a reminder that disease does not discriminate. Crying, both the weak sobs of adults too exhausted to weep properly and the piercing wails of children who don't understand why their parents can't make the pain stop. These sounds layer over each other, creating a symphony of suffering that investigators' audio equipment captures with disturbing clarity. But perhaps most terrifying is what people feel in their own bodies. Visitors to the isolation ward, even those who enter in perfect health, report sudden onset of symptoms that mimic the diseases that once ravaged this space. Crushing headaches that appear within minutes of entering. Waves of nausea so severe that grown adults have collapsed to their knees. Sudden fevers that spike their temperature by several degrees in the span of heartbeats. Chills that make teeth chatter uncontrollably. The sensation of not being able to catch their breath, as if their lungs are filling with fluid. These symptoms are not psychosomatic suggestions. Medical equipment confirms the physiological changes. Heart rates spike. Body temperatures actually increase. Oxygen saturation levels drop measurably. And then, as soon as the person leaves the isolation ward, the symptoms vanish. Not gradually, as real illness would fade, but instantly. One step across the threshold, and fevers break, nausea disappears, breathing returns to normal. It's as if the suffering itself has soaked into the very structure of the space, and proximity to that reservoir of anguish triggers a sympathetic response in the living. The account that has become legendary among Queen Mary staff involves a security guard named Thomas Doyle, who worked the night shift in 2012. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, He was conducting his rounds through the isolation ward when he encountered a woman in a nurse's uniform. But this was not the casual costume of a historical reenactor. The uniform was authentic to the 1930s, complete with details that wouldn't be known to anyone without extensive historical knowledge. The cap, the specific style of apron, the shoes, even the way her hair was pinned back, all matched archival photographs exactly. She stood in the corridor, backlit by a light source that shouldn't exist, her face drawn with exhaustion and something darker. Something like resignation to horror. When she saw Doyle, she didn't startle or fade. She looked directly at him with eyes that held both urgency and terrible sadness. Her lips moved, and he heard her voice clearly. Not from where she stood, but as if she were speaking directly into his ear. "They're all dying," she said. "I can't help them. There's too many, and they're all dying." Her hands, he noticed, were stained with something dark that might have been blood or medicine or both. She wrung them together in distress, the gesture of someone who has worked beyond exhaustion to the point of breaking. Then she simply wasn't there anymore. No fade, no transparency, no walking away. Between one heartbeat and the next, the corridor was empty, except for Doyle and the cold and the distant sound of someone coughing their last. Doyle reported the encounter immediately. The timestamp on his radio call is documented. The tremor in his voice on the recorded transmission is not the sound of someone perpetrating a hoax. Within 20 minutes of his encounter, he developed a fever of 103 degrees, confirmed by medical personnel. He was sent home sick, and the fever lasted exactly as long as it took him to drive off the ship's property. By the time he reached the parking lot exit, his temperature had returned to normal. Recent paranormal investigations in the isolation ward have captured evidence that has stunned even veteran researchers. Electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP, recordings from this area contain not just single voices, but choruses of them. Sophisticated audio analysis has identified upwards of 15 distinct voices speaking simultaneously on some recordings, captured in frequencies both above and below normal human hearing range, until computer processing makes them audible. The voices cry for help in accents from across the British Empire and beyond. "Help me. Please, help me," repeating like a prayer that has never been answered. "I wanted to go home," in the voice of a child, over and over. "It hurts. It hurts so much," from someone whose suffering echoes across decades. "Tell my family I need them to know," from a person who likely died before word of their illness ever reached shore. The recordings are not random static shaped by wishful thinking. Linguistic experts have identified specific dialects, particular phrasings, even languages other than English, Italian, German, Yiddish, all the tongues of early 20th century immigrants seeking new lives in America, but finding only death in the mid-Atlantic. Some recordings capture what researchers describe as residual hauntings, moments replaying endlessly like a loop of spiritual film. Footsteps pacing back and forth in a small room, the rhythm of someone too sick to sleep, too feverish to rest. The creak of a door opening and closing, perhaps a nurse making rounds that never end. The clink of glass on metal, medicine being prepared for patients beyond saving. But other recordings suggest something far more interactive and disturbing. Responses to investigators' questions that couldn't be coincidental. When a team member asks how many spirits are present, a voice responds 14. When asked if they know they passed on, multiple voices cry out, "No, no, we're still here, still sick." Most chilling of all, when investigators announce they're leaving, voices plead, "Don't go, don't leave us alone." The words of people abandoned to die in isolation, still desperately seeking human company. The isolation ward has become recognized by paranormal researchers as something unique in the landscape of haunted locations. This is not a place where one tragic death or one violent act left a spiritual stain. This is a place where suffering accumulated in layers, year after year, crossing after crossing. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people experienced the worst moments of their lives in this space. They died frightened and alone, far from home, separated from loved ones, their last breaths drawn in a cold metal room, while the ocean rolled indifferently outside. That volume of anguish, concentrated in a relatively small area, appears to have created something that defies simple categorization. Not individual ghosts replaying their deaths, but a reservoir of pure despair, a spiritual battery charged with suffering and fear. People sensitive to such things describe the isolation ward as a wound in reality itself, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead has worn dangerously thin from too much tragedy pressing against it from both sides. The darkness here feels different from the shadows found elsewhere on the ship. It seems thicker, more present, almost tangible. Lights malfunction with disturbing regularity. Flashlights drain from full battery to dead in minutes. Camera equipment fails. Recording devices stop working without explanation, then resume normal function the moment they're removed from the area. Some investigators theorize that the accumulated spiritual energy in the isolation ward actively draws power from any source available, desperately trying to manifest, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to finally have someone, anyone, witness the suffering that went unrecorded and unmourned. This is the epicenter of the Queen Mary's haunting. Every other paranormal hotspot on the ship, from the swimming pool to the engine room, pales in comparison to the concentrated anguish of the isolation ward. Here, in the cold and the dark at the bow of a ship that no longer sails, the dead remain trapped in their final agonies, calling out across time for help that never come. And the living who venture into this space, seeking evidence or explanation, find themselves touching something primal and terrible. A reminder that some suffering is so profound, it refuses to fade, even after death. The isolation ward waits, patient and hungry, holding its reservoir of anguish close, ready to share its darkness with anyone brave enough or foolish enough to enter. The rain falls tonight on the Queen Mary's deck, just as it has fallen for decades in Long Beach Harbor. The same rhythmic drumming on steel. The same mist gathering around empty promenade chairs. The same water pooling in corners where passengers once danced and laughed. But something has changed over the years, something investigators and paranormal researchers struggle to explain. Why does this ship hold on to its dead so tightly? The question echoes through every investigation, every attempted cleansing, every blessing performed by priests and spiritualists who've walked these corridors. Some theorize it's the sheer volume of death, the hundreds of souls who drew their last breath somewhere within this floating city. Others point to the violent nature of so many endings, the crushed door 18, the sailor pulled into machinery, the woman who vanished into dark water. Violence leaves marks that don't fade, wounds in the fabric of a place that never quite heal. But there's another theory, whispered among those who've spent the most time aboard. Something about the ship itself. The way she was built, perhaps. The concentration of metal and wood and human memory compressed into this single vessel. A supernatural battery that doesn't just hold on to the energy of death, but draws it in, attracts it, collects it like the barnacles that once clung to her hull. 1. And here's what troubles investigators most. New spirits keep appearing. Reports surface of figures, voices, encounters that don't match any historical record. Entities that never sailed on the Queen Mary, never died within her walls, yet walk her decks, as if they've always belonged. As if the ship has become a beacon, calling to something beyond her own tragic past. Despite every effort to quiet the activity, it only intensifies. The footsteps grow louder. The cold spots multiply. More lights flicker in corridors that should be empty. Tonight, she sits in her permanent berth, lights glowing in windows where no one stands. Rain drums its eternal rhythm on steel. And somewhere deep in her belly, something moves through the darkness, preserving history that desperately wants to stay alive. What really happens when the past refuses to rest? I die. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.